Hi, my name is Shayna Medina Taub, and in this presentation we are going to be talking about cultural moral relativism. So, what is cultural moral relativism? Cultural moral relativism is a principle that aids with the explanation of what constitutes an act to be moral or immoral based upon the beliefs, practices, and views of a certain cultural group. In other words, this principle holds that the beliefs of an individual should be acknowledged and comprehended from the perspective of that individual's respective culture. Using cultural moral relativism to understand different values between opposing groups. In the text Ethics, the Fundamentals, Julia Driver provides an example where cultural moral relativism can be applied by stating that, quote, certain animals are approved eating in one culture but not another, end quote. To further explain this idea, due to religious beliefs, consuming pork products in Islamic culture is recognized as immoral. However, in American culture, the consumption of pork is not immoral. Now, this does not mean that the Islamic culture is wrong or that the American culture is right. Cultural moral relativism provides the foundation for understanding that certain groups have beliefs that are correct for that respective culture. Moral relativism versus moral universalism. In a way, moral relativism and moral universalism can be viewed as opposites of each other. Under moral relativism, because of the idea that the beliefs of cultures are to be understood from the perspective of that given culture, moral relativism holds that there is no universal truth to morality. Contrasting from this idea, moral universalism holds that there are some universal truths to morality. As an example, Julia Driver mentions that, quote, one candidate for a universal norm would be something like, causing unnecessary pain is bad. In one culture, child labor is permissible, and in another it is not, end quote. Western cultures such as America generally perceive practices such as child labor to be impermissible and immoral. However, in an Eastern culture like China, child labor is permissible. Driver states that, quote, this would be explained by saying that either one culture is just mistaken about the permissibility of child labor, or the different cultures are faced with different circumstances, and in one culture, child labor is unnecessary to family survival, whereas in another culture, it is necessary to family survival. In this case, the potential universal norm is not applicable because, quote, cultures differ in their derivative prescriptions, end quote. The causing unnecessary pain is bad argument is not universal in this case because the potential pain being caused is necessary because it is being done to help a child's family stay alive. Why is cultural moral relativism useful? One of the most prevalent arguments in favor of cultural moral relativism that Driver offers is that, quote, it seems to reflect actual moral purpose, end quote. The principle acknowledges the fact that there are massive amounts of differences between cultures, whether it is from religion, cultural history, or even something geographically specific to the culture. There is some underlying reason or basis for the existing views of that given culture. In addition to this, Driver argues that, quote, relativism also seems to offer a principled way of approaching moral disagreement, at least at the cultural level, end quote. It is no question that given the abundance of diverse cultures, there are bound to be some opposing views. When the principle of cultural moral relativism is applied correctly, it can prevent cultural bias in the act of culture A thinking that culture B is incorrect because the values of culture B are not the same as the values of culture A. An objection to cultural moral relativism. Driver explains a major flaw in cultural relativism by commenting on the idea that there is an extent to which a person can be understanding. She mentions that, quote, as long as there is a view that rights, moral rights, are being violated, most people will not think about tolerance in that context a virtue, end quote. As an example, Driver provides the situation for this objection to cultural relativism by discussing the practice of female circumcision. She explains that, quote, this is the practice in some cultures of excising a portion of the female genitalia. It is usually practiced on young girls. It is quite painful and can lead to numerous health problems. But it is practiced for cultural reasons, and some argue as a way of depriving females of sexual enjoyment, end quote. So without applying the principle of moral cultural relativism, this practice can be seen as very wrong to many different groups. However, under the principle, by default this practice is understood as correct for the respective cultures that partake in the procedure. Going back to the claim made by Driver, this cultural practice can be viewed as an attack on an individual's moral rights because a major basis as to why cultural relativism works is because of the virtue of tolerance. Without tolerance, being able to follow the values of cultural relativism becomes virtually impossible. Although cultural moral relativism is an excellent it is an excellent principle to follow to understand the norms of diverse cultures, we can definitely see that there are some important objections that need to be considered when using the principle. This concludes the presentation on cultural moral relativism.